Good morning, everybody. Welcome to the Wilson Center. It's wonderful to have all of you with us. I understand there'll be over 300 joining us this morning for this talk about the future of the USMCA, or as it's called in Mexico, TEMEC. And we're very fortunate to have with us the Undersecretary for Foreign Trade in Mexico's Secretariat of the Economy, Luz Maria de la Mora, or Luzma de la Mora, as she is widely known. Luzma is a very accomplished, not only public servant, but actor in the private sector, actor in the civil society sector, and has served Mexico under a number of different administrations. So Mexico is certainly fortunate to have her serving in this key position at this time as we move forward with a new trade agreement across North America. And I have to mention that Luzma also spent some time at the Wilson Center as a visiting scholar. And so we're happy to have her with us again today to explore everything that's going to be happening in the next several months as we move to implement the USMCA. I want to tell everybody that you can send questions in during this period. We'll have a period where I talk with Luzma, and she will initially make some remarks. We'll have a Q&A between us, and then we're going to invite your questions. So you can send those questions in to via Twitter at Mexico Institute, or via email, and that would be at mexico@wilsoncenter.org. So Twitter with the at Mexico Institute, or email to mexico@wilsoncenter.org. So thank you again for joining us, and Luzma, thank you for coming with us. I know you want to make some initial remarks with your perspectives, so please begin.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Ambassador Wayne. It is always a great pleasure to be with you. I very much appreciate the opportunity of being with you guys, with all of you in this format. I think that we're innovating in this sense. We are using technology to have these kinds of presentations, events, Q&A. I think this is fantastic. So I do appreciate the opportunity. Thank you, Ambassador Wayne, for this invitation. Thank you, the Mexico Institute of the Wilson Center. It's always a pleasure. It's always a privilege to be back with you. I appreciate greatly the opportunity of being here with you to give you some remarks about where we are in Mexico with respect to the implementation of the US-Mexico-Canada Agreement. I think that we are making good progress. I just want to, since we're innovating in these kinds of formats, I just want to make sure that we have the presentation, that it's clear for all of you. If you could just confirm that you're seeing it, I would very much appreciate it. Can you see the presentation?
Not yet.
Okay, give me 1 second, please. I will share my presentation, and that's okay.
Now
Now
we are. Now
perfect. Now, learning by doing. Okay, well, so I just want to spend a few minutes with you on 3 specific issues. I would like to talk a little bit about where we are in terms of the ratification process. Second, I would like to explain a little bit of where we are with respect to Mexico's work plan towards USMCA implementation. And a third point that I would like to discuss with you has to do with what are the pending issues towards implementation. So with respect to the USMCA ratification process, as you know, Mexico, the US, and Canada, the 3 Congress, have already, the 3 legislative powers have already approved of the agreement. Mexico was the first one to approve the USMCA on June 19, 2019. Then on December 12, the Mexican Senate approved the protocol of amendment to the USMCA, and also an environmental cooperation and customs verification agreement. So Mexico was the first country to get approval of these instruments in its Senate. Later on, it was the US that got approval of the USMCA implementing bill in December of last year, and in January of this year, the Senate, and later on it was signed by President Trump on January 29. And the last one to get it approved was the Canada, the Canadian Parliament, which approved it finally after the three readings in the House of Commons and 3 readings in the Senate on March 13. So by March of this year, the 3 legislatures had already approved all of the instruments that have to be approved in order for the USMCA to be ratified. Now, as you know, on April 2nd, Canada and Mexico exchanged diplomatic notes with its partners, saying that we have concluded our domestic procedures to be able to implement USMCA. Now, what the agreement says is that USMCA will become effective or will enter into effect on the first day of the 3rd month after the last notification was received. So where we are right now in this ratification process is that the US is still pending sending its notification to Canada and Mexico. Once that happens, then we can count the days. So let's say that the US sent its notification in April, then we're talking about July. July 1st could be the earliest in which the US-Mexico-Canada agreement could become effective. Now, let me go to my second point, which has to do with where we are with respect to Mexico's work plan and where we are with respect to implementation. As you know, as opposed to Canada and the US, in Mexico, we approved the agreement, the treaty, the international treaty that was negotiated. That is what is approved. That's what becomes law. The Protocol 2 and the Environmental Cooperation Agreement and Customs Terms was also approved. However, for us to be able to comply with all of the commitments that we made in the USMCA, we also need to adjust some of our domestic legislation so that we can actually implement this agreement in the way it was negotiated and consistent with our commitments in USMCA. It is for that reason that the Senate in Mexico and the Chamber of Deputies in Mexico, both of them have been working on adjusting some legislation, and in some cases it may be an overhaul of the legislation. And we're talking about a few ones. We're talking about the infrastructure quality law, which basically deals with technical barriers to trade. It's the standards law that is being on the works. The industrial property law, which has already been introduced in the Senate. Its USMCA requires some adjustments to Mexico's industrial property law. And the Senate decided, Senator Perez Astorga decided that it may be better to just do a complete overhaul so that we have a modern industrial property legislation in Mexico. We also have the reform to the federal criminal law so that we can comply with issues related to sanctions that have to be implemented in case there's a violation of some provisions. We're talking also about the reform to the federal copyright law, the reform to the federal plant variety law that also has to do with protection of seeds, and the general import and export tax law that reflects changes to the harmonized system and other stuff. So those are some of the laws that we're working with Congress before all these things happened, this emergency happened, we were making good progress with Congress. As you all know, we have suspended activities in Mexico except for those that are considered essential. So in that respect, we are waiting and see how Congress could take over work that has been done. But I want to tell you that this is a very solid package that we know that whenever Congress comes back, we will be able to work with Congress to get this legislation approved, and hopefully we will be able to comply with all of our USMCA commitments. Now, what would be other legislative matters that need to take place before the USMCA is in place in Mexico? Well, we also need the Senate approval of the Mexico, US, and Canada Environmental Cooperation Agreement. This is an agreement that was signed in Buenos Aires on November 30th, 2018, parallel to the signing of the USMCA. This is a very important agreement because it will replace the NAFTA Parallel Environmental Agreement, and it basically takes the experience from the North American Environmental Cooperation Agreement, and it also takes all of the administrative and organizational structure that was created during more than 2 decades of operation of this agreement. So we are also in the process of getting this agreement in place, and there are all other administrative stuff that we need to look into, like the degree of approval. At the end of the day, when the USMCA will become effective, Mexico will have to issue a decree that will actually say when this agreement will become effective. We also have to adjust our tariff decree and some other administrative instruments that will have to be published in the Diario Oficial de la Federación, which is the equivalent of your federal register. Now, internally, we are also leading a high-level task force for USMCA proper implementation. This is a task force that is led by our Secretary Graciela Marquez, Secretary of Economy, who is leading this effort. And this is integrated by the Ministries of Economy, Finance, Agriculture, Environment, Foreign Affairs, and Labor. The reason why we put together this group is because we want to make sure that each one of the ministries that have some kind of responsibility with respect to the proper implementation of the agreement are participating actively, and that they are adjusting the things that need to be adjusted, and also that they will be ready for the correct implementation of the agreement. We feel that this coordination is helping us to also put in place some of the most challenging provisions of USMCA, for example, the rapid labor response mechanism. Now, the secretary meets with her counterparts on a monthly basis, and we have an action plan that we are currently working from our offices at home, but we continue to work every day on the progress that we need to make for USMCA to be in place. And now I would like to go to the third point that I wanted to make, which has to do with what are the pending issues towards implementation. Everybody has heard a lot about them, and I would like to give you a little bit of perspective and a little bit of rest with respect to what are the things that we need to do at the trilateral level. As you have heard all over the place, there's this question about the uniform regulations, specifically in the automotive sector. I just want to clarify two things. When we're talking about uniform regulations, we're not talking about negotiating anything new. We're not talking about changing the percentage of regional content of any of the rules of origin that were negotiated. The uniform regulations, what they do and what the reason why they are important and the reason why we are working on them is that they allow the final user of the rule of origin or that will get the benefit of this preferential access, they give them clarity. What is the methodology that will that can be used to estimate the percentage of regional value content? What is the formula that can be used? What are the documents that need to be used in order to show that you are actually complying with the percentage or the rule of origin that is provided in each one of the tariff item lines? We are working on the most important uniform regulations, which have to do with the automotive sector. We understand the concern of the industry in the sense that the industry needs to know with clarity how to estimate this new value content. And that's why we have been working with the USTR for quite some time. Since the very first day that we got into office in December 2018, we knew that this was something that was important for industry, and it was something important for us to be able to work trilaterally. This is something that we cannot do individually. This is something that has to be done at the trilateral level, so that when products cross borders and products request for the preferential treatment, the three of us have the same understanding of how to assess this percentage, and also what are the documents that will be useful to assess this. I want also to mention that uniform regulations are only a way of interpreting the rule of origin. They're a way of clarifying the rule of origin. And the challenge that we have right now is that we're close to getting the USMCA in place. We know that for the automotive sector, it is important to be able to have in place a methodology that they will need to have in this sector to be able to show that they're complying, so as not to have to pay any tariffs. But we also know that we have made good progress, and we're still making good progress. We have been in constant consultations with industry, and we will continue to work until the day of the implementation of the agreement. Let me make some specific comments with respect to USMCA uniform regulations. They are, we have to work on US uniform regulations for 4 chapters that have to do with not only the automotive sector, but also other sectors like textile and apparel and customs procedures. So this is something that it's taking most of our time here at the Ministry, at the Undersecretary of Foreign Trade. We are at full swing working with our US and Canadian counterparts. And we're also working with the auto sector in another provision of the agreement that has to do with the alternative staging regimes. That is, what kind of transitions the original equipment manufacturers need in order for them to be able to comply with the new regional value content of the agreement and some of the requirements. So this is one of the most important activities in which we're involved right now. We are heavily, we're very much invested in all of this, and we're working very hard with the US and Canada in defining these uniform regulations. One last thing with respect to uniform regulations. When NAFTA was implemented in 1994, uniform regulations were not issued until September of 1995. So it took some time to work on them. But also, the reason why I'm mentioning this is that it has been the case in which an agreement becomes effective without uniform regulations in place. In this case, the USMCA requires that uniform regulations are published the same day that the USMCA becomes effective, and that's what we're intending to do. The second thing I want to talk about is has to do with the panelist selection. This is a trilateral work that we're doing. We need to choose panelists for Chapter 10. Chapter 10 is now what used to be Chapter 19, Trade Remedy Laws. We are working on selecting up to 25 candidates from each country. And Chapter 31, which is what used to be Chapter 20, now it's Chapter 31, state-to-state dispute settlement. And we are in the process of selecting up to 10 from for each country. We also need to select the panelists for the rapid response labor mechanism. You know that there's Annex 31A for the Mexico and US mechanism, and Annex 31B for the Mexico-Canada mechanism as part of the protocol. We also need to choose 3 panelists, going up to 5. Then we need to exchange those lists of panelists, and we're also working on the rules of procedures for the mechanism, how these mechanisms of dispute settlement mechanisms are going to work. And I also want to mention, last but not least, other trilateral issues that we need to work on prior to entry into effect. We are in the process of doing the legal verification of the protocol of amendment. Mexico, the US, and Canada are currently verifying the Spanish and French versions of the protocol of amendment, and we hope to be concluded during April. And the last thing, as I mentioned at the beginning, has to do with the diplomatic notes exchange. Canada and Mexico, we have completed with that part of the process. We are waiting for the US to send us over the notifications. And as I mentioned, the USMCA will enter into effect on the first day of the 3rd month following the exchange of notification of completion of internal procedures required for the USMCA to take effect. We both are waiting for the US, and then after that, we will be ready, hopefully, to put USMCA in place. So those are my comments. Maybe you want to, I don't know, ask about other things that I wanted to talk about COVID-19, but I think that it's better to have this in a conversation way. Thank you.
Great, thank you. So Luzma, I think if you could unshare your screen.
Yes, that's right.
That was excellent.
Thank you. Okay, give me 1 second. Yeah. Now.
There we are. We're back.
We're back.
That was a great introduction, and you touched on many of the key issues. So before we get back into some of those implementation issues, let me just ask, from Mexico's perspective, what would you hope to have achieved and underway 1 year from when this does go into effect? What do you see as the potential of this agreement for Mexico? And you can put this in the context of the COVID-19 situation.
Right. Yeah. Thank you, Tony. Yes, I think that for Mexico, having USMCA in place and understanding what is the value of an agreement like this one or any international trade agreement has to do with one key word, which is certainty. Knowing exactly what are what's the name of the game, what are the rules that producers in North America, investors, exporters will have to face. And I think that certainty at these times of huge uncertainty will be key for Mexico to be able to be part of the North American value chain. If I were to imagine, because I think that's the correct word right now, if I were to imagine how North America and Mexico could be playing in the North American equation in 1 year from now, I think that just having USMCA in place will offer the economic actors a source of certainty and a source of a sort of way to find the best way to develop their businesses to continue to work on value chains. I think that what we're living today with the COVID-19, this health emergency, it brings up many questions. And one of them, I think, in terms of what are doing is to be able to protect our citizens. And we need to make sure that those borders are that they help us to effectively protect our barrier to integration. So I think that this lesson that we're getting today is that USMCA may be able to put us in a better position, the three of us, Mexico, the US, and Canada, to effectively develop those regional value chains, that regional integration, to provide certainty with respect to the rules and allow us to shape the North American integration scheme in a way in which we can respond both to the health needs and the health emergency, and at the same time allow us to strengthen those regional value chains. That's why I see this is important for Mexico, and that's how I imagine our region 1 year from now.
That's excellent. I think that this is an important answer that we've already put in place to all the debate that's coming up now about diversifying supply chains, shortening supply chains. As you point out, the three countries have built over 25 years a tremendously effective set of supply chains.
Mm-hmm.
And now we see the opportunity, and we have the opportunity to take it forward within the framework of this new agreement.
Right.
So now to hop back to some of the specifics. Clearly the auto industry and the vehicle industry and the parts manufacturers and the vehicle manufacturers are quite concerned about the effects that the COVID-19, the coronavirus, are having on their ability to make changes, knowing what changes are ahead of them. A number of them have asked for some delay in the staging, I think, of the parts of this new treaty as it comes into effect. So what's the perspective of Mexico, but also, as you've been discussing this with your colleagues from Canada and the United States, how are people looking at this situation?
Yeah, that's a very good question, Tony. I think that what we're looking at is, if we are facing an unprecedented situation where all of us in the three countries are trying to deal with this pandemic in the best possible way. And that has implied, at least in Mexico, for example, the auto sector is not considered an essential activity sector, so they have had to shut down plants in Mexico. That obviously implies that companies in Mexico, even if they're doing home office like we are, they're facing longer periods before they can come back and retake their activities. However, having said that, I also want to say that we in Mexico continue to have permanent meetings with industry. The Director General for responsible for this area, Felix Gonzalez, and all of his people are in constant communication with the Mexican industry at the industry level, at the association level, but also at the firm level, meeting virtually with all of these companies. We understand that we may need a transition period, and from the Mexican side, from the minister level, from Madam Secretary Graciela Marquez, myself, and all of the technical people have requested, from a very practical perspective, to have a longer transition period for the implementation of the uniform regulations. This is still something that we are discussing. We do not have a final response from the US, but probably we will have to see how things evolve as the pandemic evolves. What I can tell you is that we are definitely in the process of developing those uniform regulations. We continue to work with industry, and we want to make sure that we are ready for industry to know exactly what the uniform regulations they will need to comply with the day that USMCA is in place. We don't know exactly how this pandemic is going to evolve. We don't know, for example, in Mexico, if the date that we have been presented by government, by the General Council of Health, which is April 30th, we don't know if that will be the final date or if the period of suspension of activities will have to even go any further. That will have obvious implications for industry, that will have implications not only for the automotive sector, but I would say that it will have implications for all sectors in the economy. So I would like to say that let's play it by ear, but I can assure you that on our end, we continue to work so that at the earliest possible time, we will have these uniform regulations available for industry because we understand what they're facing. Thank you.
Thank you. Maybe I could ask just a related question that's not actually part of the treaty, but is what's going on right now. There's been some difference in which industries are designated as essential in the three countries, if I understand. And as you know, in the United States, some auto companies have been asked to try to contribute to making necessary equipment to meet the demands of the crisis. And I think there's also the aerospace industry is deemed essential in Canada, but not in the United States. Are there discussions going on also between the three countries to try to bring some uniformity to how we're treating the supply chains at this moment as we get ready to implement?
Yes, that's a very good question. In Mexico, it is the General Council on Health, Consejo General de Salubridad, that has the final decision with respect to what are the activities that are considered to be essential and which ones are non-essential. So the Ministry of Economy is part of this General Council. Secretary Marquez has been participating actively in all of these decisions, but at the end of the day, the last word has to do with health considerations. There have been conversations with our US and Canadian counterparts with respect to which activities are considered essential and which are non-essential. I know that right now, yesterday, for example, one new agreement came published in Diario Oficial that allows in companies in the steel industry, in the glass sector, carbon, some activities that will be able to be considered essential and they can continue to operate within some specific standards, of course. But there's been reconsideration of some of the activities that are taking place. We do acknowledge that we do not have a perfect fit in terms of coordination. We have not been able to get the same sectors operating in the same way. But I think that this is also a result of an emergency that we had never dealt with in the past. And this is something that we need to learn for the future. How do we coordinate, or how do we manage to keep the health of the people as a priority? And how can we manage to keep those regional value chains still in place? That's something that I think that we will have to learn from this, and we will have to get the lessons for the future from this.
I think it's fair to say that all three governments are learning.
That's right.
An unprecedented opportunity to learn and to get better in the future. But let me switch a little bit to the labor sector.
Yes.
Mexico has passed a very impressive set of labor reforms. You had a 4-year implementation period from the start. We're now into that to put them fully in place. That, of course, is also being affected by this coronavirus. But you have a number under the new provisions. There are new commitments. There are going to be some complaints filed, no doubt, from the United States. You're setting up, as you said, the rapid dispute settlement mechanism. How do you see this moving forward? Will you, the moment this gets implemented, do you expect that there will be certain challenges that will be filed and taken forward? And will the dispute settlement mechanism be ready to be functioning, you know, from day one, not literally from day one, but figuratively from day one, to take on this new area of, or this area of enhanced responsibility?
Right. Well, yes, thank you for the question. I think that the labor provisions in USMCA are certainly a huge change with respect to what we had in the past. Basically, the reason this is, I would explain, is that Mexico has a new labor reform. Since, as you know, there was a constitutional reform in 2017 that acknowledges the rights of workers in many different areas. In May of 2019, under the current administration, President López Obrador pushed very strongly for a new labor law in Mexico. So we're talking about a huge overhaul of labor legislation in Mexico and the labor regime in Mexico. This is really something that, in my opinion, is one of the most important changes in labor legislation in decades. And I would say that this is the first structural reform of the López Obrador administration, because we are talking about a 180-degree change with respect to labor relations, labor employer relations. And we see this as a very positive step, in the sense that what we all want in Mexico is that workers enjoy better incomes, they enjoy better labor conditions, and that they can actually benefit from the integration that, the benefits that integration brings to the economy. We want to democratize those benefits. Now, what we see in in chapter 23 of USMCA, and what we see in Annexed 23A, and what we see in the protocol, are basically a reflection of how Mexico is going to implement its labor reform. The labor reform is a decision of the Mexican, I would say, it's a Mexican decision. It's a Mexican state decision, no? And we will have done it with or without USMCA. I am certain that this is a labor reform that will be implemented in such a way that it will reflect the new relations between workers and employers. And I am also certain that if we are able to get this reform correctly in place, then we should not see any kind of dispute settlement mechanisms in place. Second point that I want to make, the labor reform has its own transition periods, okay? So we know that from the very first day that there are transition periods in which we are going to be implementing this reform, and transition periods that will require some time for all of the country to be able to show that the reform is at full swing. Third point, we are working right now with the US and with Canada in establishing the rules of procedure for that rapid labor response mechanism. And we know that this will be something that we will have to face, that is something that we have never done before in the past. The US has never deal with this mechanism in a proper way, we are also going to have to work with our counterparts in the US and in Canada so that whatever challenges may be presented to Mexico from the US or from Canada, or eventually from Mexico to the US and to Canada, because this is a reciprocal mechanism. I mean, this is not only a one-way mechanism, this is reciprocal. What we may be able to use this mechanism to address these issues. Thank you.
Yes, this is clearly will be a complicated process, and I know goes far beyond the remit of economia in this. You have to work with many other agencies, and setting up new institutions is a complicated process.
Right.
As Mexico is very laudably trying to do right now and working hard to do. One of the new areas for this agreement is the internet. And there's greatly expanded coverage in USMCA of the internet. Along with that will be enforcement responsibilities. There's also the important need to cooperate across the three countries, not only in enforcement, but then also in bad third-party actors who come in and try to steal things or disrupt things. How do you foresee this part of the agreement moving forward, being implemented, and what do you see as some of the big opportunities and also big challenges to effectively having this agreement move ahead?
Right. Yeah. Thank you for this question, Tony. I think that the digital economy, e-commerce, and all of the provisions that are included in the USMCA are not only the state of the art with respect to how this industry is evolving, but I also think that it puts Mexico in a privileged position with respect to other countries to be able to take advantage of the opportunities that the digital economy brings. On one end, we have challenges. And as I mentioned at the beginning, some of the challenges have to do with adjusting our industrial property law, adjusting our copyrights law, adjusting also our federal code, our penal code that has to do with what are the sanctions that we're going to be implementing. So we need to beef up our enforcement. No? But this is going to help us to create a policy framework and a policy environment that will actually help us to develop a very strong digital economy in Mexico, digital platforms, all of the digital environment that we need to develop an economy that will be able to be a more democratic economy that creates a society 5.0 in Mexico. Now, what are the specific areas of opportunity that we see? We know that in USMCA, there's a lot of cooperation, and I think that that's important that we keep that in mind because this is a new policy area in which we are going to be working very strongly with the US and Canada. We also have issues related to consumer protection. That's extremely important because it's not only that we are dealing with digital platforms, digital providers, but we're also seeing how we can ensure that consumer is protected, that privacy is guaranteed, how we're going to manage data, and all of these challenges that are presently at the table and that we need to work with the US and Canada to develop the best North American framework. And I also think my third point in this, and it will be my last point, has to do with the opportunities that the digital economy and the internet bring to the small and medium-sized companies, especially in Mexico. You know that almost more than 99% of firms in Mexico are small and medium-sized companies that find it extremely difficult to participate in some way in either international markets, in international trade, or in integrating in global value chains. And what the internet is going to bring them is also the opportunity of participating more efficiently. Now, from our perspective in Mexico, we are organized number of activities, seminars, policy frameworks for SMEs to be able to be part of this economy. So we see these provisions in the agreement as a way to integrate SMEs, and that's something that we have tried in the past and we have not been that successful. So we hope that we will with these provisions in the agreement. Thank you.
Thank you. So one of the areas of the new agreement that I'm quite excited about is indeed what you were just talking about, the opportunities ahead. There's a new committee on competitiveness. It's going to be initiated across North America. And at least in my reading of that, I hope this will be looking at the kind of steps that can help all three countries become more competitive in the world in a broad sense, which would include things that we've talked about before together, about skills for workers, about workforce development, about meeting the challenges of technology transforming workplaces, and sometimes eliminating jobs, or at a minimum, greatly transforming those jobs. But there are many other aspects to this. What do you see as the future agenda, the future-oriented agenda that would tie into this idea of a North America that is more competitive and more effective in the global economy, but also in meeting the needs of its consumers and workers?
Yes, thank you, Tony. Yes, in fact, there is a chapter on competitiveness in USMCA. This is the first time that we have integrated this issue in the agreement. And that's because we recognize that we need to coordinate our policies at the trilateral level to be able to develop an agenda at that respect. So far, Mexico and the US, under this administration, we have been working with the US Department of Commerce on developing a strategic economic dialogue that contains a number of issues that have to deal with how do we strengthen the competitiveness of North America and what Mexico can bring to the table to increase that competitiveness. We're also working with Canada on the Canada-Mexico alliance, and we're also putting competitiveness at the center of the agenda. So once the USMCA is in place, we already have a substantive agenda on both ends, but we need to bring this to a trilateral dimension, to the North American dimension. Without a question, I think that we need to look at infrastructure. We need to look at trade facilitation. We need to look at transportation. We need to look at customs facilities, border crossings, all of the infrastructure aspects of trade, telecommunications, transportation, etc. However, we also acknowledge that probably the most important factor of competitiveness in the region will have to be our human talent, our talent pool, to be able to maintain North America competitive. And in that respect, the USMCA brings us the opportunity to develop an agenda so that we have probably a long-term perspective, 5-10-year perspective on how we can work to train the kind of human resources that we need in order for us to respond to the pace in which the economy is moving, the digital economy, for example. We also need to work with the private sector to find the needs of the private sector. And that's something that we're already working on at the Ministry of Economy, in the Undersecretary of Industry. We're already working in finding the proper match for industry. And since Mexico also is a very important part of the North American value chain, we in Mexico are already working with different technical schools and different universities to make sure that we are developing and we are offering our own people, our own human resources, the kind of education that they need to have in order for them to be able to participate in North America. So the human resource, we're not only looking at it from the labor reform perspective, that's very important. We know that labor rights, the right of association and the right for collective bargaining should be at the center. But another very important aspect has to do with what is the human talent that Mexico can develop. We have a young population. We have a very talented population. It's always very encouraging to hear companies in Mexico always praising the human talent in Mexico. Human talent is really something that will help Mexico bridge the development gap and will help us to strengthen North America in the 21st century. So we are ready to work with you, Tony, with the Mexico Institute on this workforce development plan. And I think that all of the areas that you have identified fit perfectly well with the kind of human talent that we need to develop for the region. Thank you.
Excellent, thank you. Let me just 2 more items and then we'll start going directly to questions and answers. Could you say a little bit about regulatory cooperation and what you see as the priorities? And secondly, could you say a little bit about that environmental agreement? And will this start having practical effects, let's say along the US-Mexico border with the maquiladoras and in other areas?
Yes. Regulatory cooperation is today a very important aspect for industry, because what we need to do is to create the proper rules. We need to have rules, we need to have standards, but we need to have the less costly standards, and we need to make sure that industry can comply with the rules that will allow them to develop effectively without incurring in unnecessary costs. So for us, one of the innovations, and I want to say that that's one of the new things that we're seeing in USMCA, has to do with the sectoral annexes. These sectoral annexes basically take the best practices all over the world, and they include the rules and regulations that the 3 countries will have to request from industry, so that industry has a more harmonious regulatory environment. And sorry, from our perspective, this regulatory coherence and this regulatory coordination at a trilateral level makes complete sense in a number of sectors. So that's where we see a push for the competitiveness of industry in this aspect of creating the best business environment, which will yield, of course, in very positive aspects in integration in North America. Now, with respect to the environmental aspect of the agreement, there are many issues that we're dealing with at the environmental from the environmental perspective. But I want to say that there are a couple of things that we are looking into. First, when NAFTA was negotiated and was put in place, we also saw the North American Cooperation Agreement in place. That was a real success story. Probably we don't talk much about that, but it did create a North America environmental cooperation regime. That's a word that I wanted to use. Why? Because we have laws that are in some way that are trying to accomplish the same thing, which is how do we protect the environment, and how do we ensure that we have a legal framework that is consistent with the needs of the region. We have an organization, a structural organization that has a body based in Montreal that was able to develop a number of programs, to develop a number of projects, to develop rules, standards, a legal framework that did create a North American environmental region. So what we're doing with this new environmental agreement is to bring the best of that environmental regime into a new North America environmental agreement, which will be the responsibility in Mexico of the Mexican Ministry of Environment and Natural Resources. In addition to that, there is also, I think, a very important step forward with respect to the North America Development Bank. There is this acknowledgement that we need to allocate financial resources to the border, to the infrastructure of the border, to address environmental needs, environmental questions that we are facing every day. And for some time, the United States had refused to acknowledge the NatBank as an instrument to help protect the environment at the border. So with this reallocation of resources from the US, which is quite substantive, I think that we will be able to give the priority that the environment needs and environmental infrastructure needs at the border in the area, for example, Tijuana, San Diego, and all across the border, to develop the kind of infrastructure that is needed to address the environmental challenges that we see as a result of a very dynamic border. So I am quite positive and I am quite optimistic that with implementation of USMCA, the environment will get some more attention and also will be able to get the resources needed for its protection. Thank you.
Good. Thank you very much. Just a reminder to all of our listeners, we've already started getting a number of questions, but you can tweet your questions in to at Mexico Institute, or you can email them to mexico@wilsoncenter.org. So, Undersecretary, we have a number of questions related to the request to delay implementation, not surprisingly, until 2021. Given all that's going on with the coronavirus and the shutdowns and the need to prepare, when do you think we might get some signals as to what the governments are thinking about all these requests? I noted that the Mexican Auto Association just reiterated yesterday their worry about this. And then we had just a few days ago, the Senate Finance Committee, I think, sent a letter to USTR asking for this.
Yeah, that's, thank you, Tony. Thank you for the questions that are coming from the audience. We understand that there is a practical aspect to all of this implementation. And I want to tell you, and I want to reiterate what I have already said, in the sense that we, in the Ministry of Economy, we are very aware about the practical challenges that this implementation will bring to the table. We have absolute understanding of what the industry is facing, and we're willing to have a transition period specifically for the auto sector, as it has been requested. And as I have mentioned, we have put this issue on the table many times, but unfortunately, this is not a Mexican decision. This is a trilateral decision. And we are still in discussions with our counterparts and see if there would be any kind of flexibility on their part. If there were to be any flexibility on the part of the US and Canada, we're more than happy to do that. We can very well see a scenario in which we have USMCA in place, entering into force in July, August, September, I don't know, in the very near future. And at the same time, we could also have a transition period for the automotive sector. But as I said, this is something that has the trilateral consensus. Thank you.
Thank you. We have a question here related to the lawsuits in Mexico against the Mexican labor law, the labor reform. There were a number of lawsuits filed. And the question is, what is the status of those lawsuits? Are they still moving forward? Are they pending? Is that going to slow down the labor reform?
Yes. As you know, in Mexico, there's always the possibility of going to the court to challenge whatever policy comes from the administration. We know that, yes, there are some cases, and we know that many have been dismissed. Others are still in the pipeline of the court. But we also know that this is a reform that will take place. This is a reform that the Ministry of Labor is working closely with all of the labor unions. I think that there's been very good progress made in terms of the actual implementation. And we see that this is something that, I mean, there may be challenges from from a judicial venue, no, but this is not going to stop the implementation of the agreement, or I'm sorry, of the labor reform in Mexico.
Good. Thank you very much. We also have a question about how the three countries are working together to address circumvention of tariff or duty orders. Note one of the issues being in the steel and aluminum industries, but I'm sure that's the case elsewhere. This is the concern about third-party imports coming in and not meeting the requirements of the treaty.
Yeah, this transshipment question is something that has been present for quite some time. I think that this is an issue that the three of us need to make sure that is dealt with properly. And I want to say that in the agreement, specifically the chapter related to customs and customs procedures, does provide some very specific ways in which the three countries can either avoid or deal with transshipment. We in Mexico have had in the past many cases in which products coming from third countries or other regions come through the Mexican border as labels being produced in the US, and us knowing that this is not produced in the US. So the USMCA does provide for those kinds of mechanisms at the border and in terms of trade facilitation, but also customs verification, customs procedures to make sure that transshipment is not allowed in the region. We understand that this is an important question for industry at all levels, and we are certain that the kind of cooperation and the kind of relation that the customs authorities in the three countries, and specifically between Mexico and the US, has been extremely positive. And I think that it will continue to be positive in the sense that it will allow us to address those practices, those bad practices, in a more effective way. I also want to say that when those things happen, we also have the mechanisms to get the information and also to deal with them in a more expeditious way. Thank you.
Thank you. And I know there had already been a lot of work over the past decade to try and get closer cooperation on the borders and to make that more seamless, including having US and Mexican officials working in the same unit right on the border, in the same offices, and then also moving to a much more electronic system. So there's much more that's done digitally. Are there any timelines that you can foresee? We've had some in the past that we haven't met for moving toward more digital treatment of all the paperwork and everything else that's due, and then using higher technology more effectively at the border to actually facilitate this trade. Are there certain committees within USMCA that will be working on this?
Yes, yeah. In fact, each one of the chapters provides for the possibility of creating either a working group or a committee to address the agenda. And I can tell you specifically that we have been working with our counterparts in the Ministry of Finance, in the Customs Office here in Mexico, but also in the US. We have permanent contact, permanent communication. We have a work agenda with them. And the relationship between the Customs Office in Mexico and the Customs Office in the US is extremely fluid. It's extremely positive. They work on a permanent basis. As you said, we are very fortunate, Tony, to have today a history of more than 27 years in terms of custom cooperation between Mexico, the US, and Canada with respect to customs operations. So we are taking that experience, we're taking that kind of relationship that there already is there. And we are bringing it to the USMCA, and we hope to be able to build on that. And I can assure you that that will be the case. Of course, the challenges are important. What we're seeing today with this pandemic presents new challenges to the customs authorities. But I think that we are in a better position than we were when NAFTA became implemented, because we already have a lot of work done, and we have a lot of experience in that respect. So we hope to be able to use that experience to address the challenges that USMCA will present. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Undersecretary, can you say a little bit about Mexico's plans to attract more foreign direct investment and more investment? As you know, last year was not a stellar year when all the final figures came out in that, and now this is a difficult economic situation. But in principle, USMCA should be very positive for attracting that investment. So what plans do you and your colleagues have for promoting investment in Mexico?
Yes, thank you for the question. Let me give you one number. So I think that it will put these things in perspective. Yes, last year, Mexico's foreign direct investment increased by almost 8%. So that was something that many people didn't expect, in the sense that FDI flows throughout the world were coming down, and FDIs into the US were coming up. So it was not that, it was expected that Mexico's FDI flows were going to go down too, and it was not the case. So Mexico had a very positive result in 2019, in spite of conditions throughout the world with respect to FDI. Now, what are we expecting with respect to how do we attract foreign direct investment? Mexico is an economy that is integrated into the global marketplaces. It's integrated into North America, but it's also integrated into the EU market, into the Asian market. We do acknowledge that what we're seeing with this pandemic, it may be a reassessment of global value chains, and it may also be the case that value chains may become more regional, since we understand that supply and demand have to be closer. We saw the challenges that were presented when China was not able to provide the kind of inputs, products, etc., that traditionally it had been offering. So we know that Mexico is ideally positioned to continue to be a part of the supply chain in North America. And we know that the USMCA provides the legal framework, the rules, and the provisions that companies will have to deal with and will have to face when they want to be part of the North America equation. So we do see the USMCA in place, and we do see Mexico as a very important actor, as a key actor in not only the manufacturing industry in North America, but of all the supply chain in the agricultural sector, in the services sector. And we know that we do have the talent, we have the infrastructure, we have the companies. Mexico is unique in many respects. Mexico is, for example, a producer of sophisticated manufacturing. So I do think that Mexico will become a more attractive place for FDI as a result of these conditions that we're living right now, but also as a result of USMCA. What are we doing in Mexico? We are working with industry, with the different industries throughout Mexico, to identify specifically where are the needs to complete the value chains. We are also working with industry to identify what are the new niches, what are the new sectors that we need to work with from a legal perspective, from creating the policy framework, as I said, for example, the digital economy, but also the sectors that need to be boosted for us to be able to offer the kind of not only infrastructure, but also the kind of policy framework and the human talent that we need to develop for this FDI to be able to become more attractive. But I think that Mexico is ideally positioned, Tony, to remain a very attractive place for foreign direct investment. And USMCA will certainly provide that kind of certainty that investors need. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I have two questions, one related to labor and one related to the environment. The one related to labor is a concern that some companies might seek to increase the wages, salaries paid to higher level, to managers and others, rather than to the workers in order to meet the minimal requirement of pay per hour, and what steps might be taken to make sure that isn't the case. Secondly, a question about whether there's going to be any opposition to the environmental cooperation agreement in the Mexican Senate.
Okay, with respect to labor, I mean, it is very clear that the labor reform in Mexico, one of the goals of that labor reform is to gradually see a higher income for workers. And that is something that I think that there's wide consensus with respect to the need for Mexico to have a real middle class and to have workers who have better standards of living. And I think that this, the way in which the legislation, the labor reform is being implemented will lead us to that result. It will take time. It will be gradual. We cannot expect to change things from one day to another. However, I want to mention a couple of things. Since President López Obrador took office, there has been an important increase in the minimum wage in Mexico, not only in Mexico, throughout the country, but also along the border. Along the border, there was an increase of 100% of those minimum wages. In Mexico, 20%. And in the past, we were always concerned about the fact that those increases in minimum wages would become pressure on inflation. That has not been the case. I think that we have seen increases in the minimum wage that have not been seen in decades. Granted that we're coming from very low levels, but we're seeing already those increases. So we think that this is going to be gradual. At the same time, to the extent that we can provide for a pool of workers that can participate in more value-added activities, we know that the market will have to pay higher wages, because we have an important differential in terms of income as a result of the activities or the industries in which labor is located. So we do see that we are putting Mexico and the workers in a better position to have a better standard of living in the next couple of years, and that USMCA and the labor reform will help to get to that point. Now, with respect to the second question, the Environmental Cooperation Agreement, we are convinced that this is an agreement that will be implemented at the same time that USMCA will be implemented. We do not see any kind of withdrawal from anybody or any kind of misgivings about the Environmental Cooperation Agreement. I think that the Ministry of Environment in Mexico is very committed to environmental protection, and it is only a matter of getting this agreement approved in the Senate. It is really a matter of agenda. It's not a matter of substance. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I have a specific question about the labor dispute mechanism. You mentioned that there's a discussion about the panelists going forward. Is there agreement on the structure and process for this mechanism? So do you think, will it be ready to go into effect if July 1 is the date? Will it on July 2nd be ready to operate?
Yes, it will be ready. We have to be ready. Now we have to be ready. I mean, there's no question that we will be ready by the time the agreement becomes effective. We have been working very closely with the Ministry of Labor here in Mexico. The Ministry of Labor is extremely committed. They have done a superb job of implementing the labor reform, working with our counterparts in Canada and the US. And what I can tell you is that we are working with both the US and with Canada, since these are two bilateral mechanisms, to develop the rules of procedures that we will have to put in place by the time the USMCA in place. I can assure you that we're working under these very innovative conditions, I have to say. We continue to work using all of the technology, and we will, we're working and we will be ready. We know that this is something that is important to the three countries. It is important for Mexico. And without a question, I can tell you that the labor mechanism will be in place by the time the USMCA is in place.
That's wonderful. So one of our questioners asked if you step back a minute and look after implementation, once you've agreed, if it's July 1st or whatever date it is, what do you see as the biggest challenges for this first year of watching implementation and managing it and making sure that things are on track? But you could pick whatever you want, 3, 5, whatever, as you think about it. Where would do you think you're going to have to give priority attention?
Well, I think that the labor aspect of USMCA, the labor mechanism, will definitely be something that we will have to pay a lot of attention. The reason is that this is the first time that Mexico is facing these kinds of mechanisms. This is something completely new. This is something that we have never done in the past. This is also something new for the US. This is something that we have never seen in the past. So we will be dealing with issues that are new. And in that respect, we have been working very hard to make sure that this is in place. But we also need to remember, Tommy, that this is an agreement that intends to bring North America, the three countries, Mexico, the US, and Canada, together so that we can remain competitive vis-a-vis the rest of the world. So for me, the challenge is, how do I make sure that Mexico becomes and remains an essential part of that competitiveness equation? And in that competitiveness equation, we have to see the labor aspect of the agreement, the environmental aspect of the agreement, but also the productive aspect of the agreement. And in that respect, we have traditional industries like the automotive sector, which has a huge potential, aircraft development, which also has huge potential, the agricultural sector, where Mexico is a top partner for the US. We are a main partner, number one buyer of many agricultural products in the US. We want to continue to have that kind of very positive relationship that we have developed. But we also have the services part. We have the digital economy. We have the development of all of the digital platforms. We have the e-commerce. We have all of this area of services that we still need to develop and to boost, because we know that that is an essential part for the manufacturing and the agricultural sector. So for me, it's competitiveness, the name of the game, and that's how I see the challenge for USMCA and for the implementation in the first year.
I think that's a very wise perspective to take. And one of our other questioners, and we're getting close to the end time here, so if anybody has a question, send it in, was in fact asking / suggesting, given the fact that all the 3 countries of North America are going through this crisis now, wouldn't it behoove the 3 to get together and discuss as you get close to implementation? Okay, how do we take this forward now? It's a different situation than we had 6 months ago. What other cooperative measures should we take? What should be our priorities as we look ahead?
Yeah, I think that's an extremely important question, in the sense that the pandemic has put us in a situation which we never expected to be. And I think that one of the ways in which the 3 countries, and it's not that I think, what we see is that the 3 countries, what we have implemented immediately are a couple of things. Raising barriers at the border. We are closing our borders. We are imposing export bans for certain medical products that are important for our population, which is something that runs against the logic of integration. No? And I think that we are facing a safety, it's not a security question, it's a safety issue. It's a health question of how do we keep our people safe and healthy in an environment in which we are expecting to have the free flow of people, of goods, services in the region. So what I see is that we need to learn from this crisis. We need to use the legal framework and the instruments that we have in USMCA. We have the experience already from this regional integration. And I think that addressing the pandemic with a perspective of the health emergency and the health priority, with also the idea of strengthening the regional value chains, where Mexico is a key part, will be essential to maintain the competitiveness of North America. So I would say that also seeing how this pandemic is will force many value chains in the world to probably become more regional, and also to see how borders can effectively be in place to address health issues, but not to hinder integration. That's a question here.
Right. I think that's excellent. It's really, this situation is reminding us that security or safety goes far beyond what we often think about, whether it be terrorists or criminals or even geopolitical rivals. In a moment when you are really thinking about the safety of your citizens, you have to cooperate in a different way. And so this will open doors for doing that across North America. We've learned in many ways that borders are not the best security network. You need to have cooperation that go beyond borders. And of course, you're going to be helping to implement an important manifestation of that in North America. So I want to thank you very much, Undersecretary Luz de la Mora. Luzma, thank you so much for joining us today. It's been wonderful to see you and to be able to have this conversation between Washington and Mexico City, and who knows how many other places across North America.
Where else? Exactly.
So thank you very much. And please, any final comments?
Thank you, Tony. It was a privilege to be here with you and all of your audience. Thank you so much for putting this event in place. Thank you for having me. Thank you for this very valuable conversation. I also value very much all of the questions and all of the comments that you have made. And I just want to say that we are more than ready to continue working in a North American perspective. And from our perspective, I want to continue to our commitment, and I want to commit myself with you right now with respect to agenda. I want the Mexico Institute to be part of this effort. And I do think that human talent, human resources have to be at the center of our agenda once USMCA is in place. I know that this will be a great benefit for the region. So thank you so much. Thank you for having us. And hopefully this will not be the last time we do these kinds of events using this kind of technology. Thank you so much.
I hope so too. Thank you again so much. And thanks very much to our audience for joining us. We look forward to having you be participants in these conversations and in this exploration of these key issues as we move forward. Thank you for being with us. Thank you again, Undersecretary, and everybody have a wonderful day wherever you are with your social distancing, fully sanitized hands, and your
That's right.
your self-quarantine. Thank you.